Well, before I did sheets that, we'll pass around a roll later. Before I did sheets that we called review sheets, I used to tell students, and I believe I mentioned this at earlier tests, that the kinds of things I would focus on for essay questions are also the kinds of things in what you studied that I would also focus on for objective questions, true, false, multiple choice. So I used to tell them one thing you should do is use the essay pool as a review sheet and look at what it focuses on and ask yourself, well, can I answer a question over that material? And since we just finished this stuff on Oedipus, I'm going to go through it a little quick, but we saw that the fate of Oedipus was to kill his father and mate with his, own mother, have an incestuous relationship with her. This was revealed to him, as we saw, by the oracle at Delphi. The current name of the oracle was Phoebus, but there were many different ones. Again, supposedly these made pronouncements for the god Apollo. And so, if you wanted some details revealed about the fate that the gods had figured out for you, you could go ask the oracle at Delphi, who would reveal some of that. And so the thought in Greek mythology was then that the gods determined our fate. And of course this links up with free will, because it raises the question, well, if there's a predetermined fate for us, can we make free choices that would escape that fate? Or are whatever choices we make going to result ultimately in fulfilling that fate? And of course we see in this Greek tragedy that the latter is true. That, Oedipus, we saw, believed that his real parents, the ones who were the subject of this prophecy, were back in Corinth, where he had been raised. He did not know that those were his adoptive parents, that he was saved from death as a child and raised by step-parents who never told him that they were not his biological parents. So he tries to avoid the fate that he would murder his father and mate with his mother by never going back to Corinth. If he's never near them, how can he murder his father or, fulfill the other part of the fate? Well, we saw that Oedipus, in trying to avoid his fate, actually ends up fulfilling it, because along the way, in the route he takes to avoid Corinth, is an intersection where three different ways meet, and he meets his real biological father, and they have an argument over who has the right of way. As I said before, I like to joke about it and say this is one of the first instances of road rage in Western literature. But as a result of the outcome of the argument, Oedipus ends up killing the person he meets in the roadway, and this person turns out to be his actual biological father. So, first part of the prophecy fulfilled. Then we saw Oedipus continues on his journey and comes to Iacosta's hometown, who turns out to be his biological mother. He does not know any of this, right? And the town is being menaced by a mythical creature. Remember, these are made-up stories, these Greek tragedies. The Sphinx, who asks people a riddle: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at midday, and 3 legs at night. And people who can't solve the riddle are killed by the Sphinx. So, very menacing character. And, they had already determined that if somebody gets rid of this Sphinx for them, they would reward them with the queen, who is now a widow, and partial rule of the kingdom there. Well, Oedipus solves the riddle that it's a human being who fits the title. In the morning, as a baby, you crawl on 4 legs. During midday, most of your life, you're walking on 2 legs, and as an old man with a cane, you're walking on 3. So the Sphinx is so distraught that somebody solved its riddle, it kills itself. And he's rewarded then with half the kingdom and Iacosta as his wife. Of course, what he does not know is that Iacosta is his biological mother. And so the second part of the prophecy is fulfilled. Now, Iacosta did not hear, but her husband went to the oracle, or a prophet came to them. I forget how this story goes, but the point is, it was revealed when Oedipus was not yet born that her husband would be murdered by his son, and so to avoid this, he leaves his son out to die with his feet bound. But then a shepherd finds him and takes him to what became his adoptive parents. Can't bear to kill him. So Iacosta believes that the prophecy was not fulfilled because she thinks her husband, rather than being murdered by his own son, who she thinks had been killed, shortly after birth, she thinks that rather than being murdered, as the prophecy said, by his son, her husband was killed by robbers along the road. Well, of course, he wasn't killed by robbers. He was killed by his son, who he met and had an argument with. So you can see that there's this idea that somehow, if there's a fate written in, for you by the gods, you will be powerless to avoid it. And so whatever choices you make are going to be choices that fulfill that fate. So they're not entirely free. If you try to escape it, you won't. So I ask you to reflect on this in question 1. If there were a predetermined fate, would you want to know it? We find Oedipus wants to know it. Iacosta doesn't. But they both end up, I think, when Oedipus finds out the truth, plucks his eyes out. When Iocaste finds that she commits suicide. So that's number one. And as I said, I'm also trying to review 20. There are a couple of different ways that we're thought to have a fate. We saw then that one of them is that the Greek gods would determine our fate, but a belief, even though there aren't too many believers in Zeus and Apollo, etc. anymore, there are people today who think that they have a fate determined for them not by the will of the Greek gods, but by the position of the stars at their birth, that the universe has a fate in store for them, and that astrology, as it studies these things, can peel away the layers of the onion for us, so to speak, and reveal our fate. So I ask, is there any good reason why a mature, intelligent 21st century person should take the concept of fate seriously or think that her actions are governed by it? So there's a question that you can get a little creative on. And also, I mean, karma is a kind of concept of fate. It's Buddhist, but I think also Hindu. We didn't go into the reading on it. As I said, it's a very obscure reading. But basically, the assumption of karma is something similar to astrology, that there's a kind of a fate, a law that governs things in the universe, and that actions we perform either earlier in this life or in a previous life, most believers in karma also believe in reincarnation, are going to somehow determine what happens in this life. So, in a sense, I'm not entirely free to determine my destiny. What I did in a past life is going to come back either for good or for bad. If there's a law of karma, it determines that if I did good things in a past life, good things may happen to me now. If I did evil, then try as I may, I'm going to have a bad, life. So, if you want to bring some things in concerning the notion of karma, you may. Well, 3, I said I wanted you to at least look at the most extreme form of scientific determinism, which is called hard determinism. It accepts the view of incompatibilism. Incompatibilism says that our actions being determined rigidly by the laws of nature are incompatible with the claim that we have enough free will for moral responsibility. For hard determinists, we do not have free will. Even if we think we do, even if we subjectively think we do, hard determinists argue that that subjective feeling is wrong. We're kidding ourselves. Now here, rather than argue that we're a dual entity with a soul that'll go on after this life, most hard determinists tend to be materialists. That is, they think we're just material beings, and as material beings we are subject to very rigid laws of nature. It takes very much the Newtonian stance on natural laws, that they are unchangeable and exceptionless. And so the point is, if the positions of atoms and molecules in your brain are what govern your choices, and the laws of nature determine how those atoms and molecules are going to react with each other, then it basically says prior causes are going to absolutely determine future choices for you. And so there's no way to escape the fact that you are chained by prior causes, as we saw. De Holbach, was it Paul-Henri de Holbach, used two metaphors. One, he says, it's as if our life is as if we're forced in living our life to draw a line in the sand, and the line we draw is forced for us by the laws of nature, and we don't make free choices. So we could respond to this extreme view in several ways. Some people say, well, wait a second, I have this awareness that I can deliberate. I can deliberate over whether to choose to do A or to do B. And the fact that I can deliberate, and that's what A is about here, means that I can make free choices, and hard determinism is wrong. When I make a choice, I could have chosen differently because I could deliberate. Well, of course, what hard determinism says is, if you thought you had a real choice between doing A or doing B, but you chose to do A, but you're convinced that you could have equally chosen to do B, the hard determinist says you're only kidding yourself. Given the prior causes that led up to your choice to do A, you had only one real option. You were going to choose to do A, no matter what, because it is forced upon you by the atoms and molecules that make you up and the laws of nature that govern those atoms and molecules. And given the same prior causes, hard determinism says there will be only one future result. If the prior causes determine you to choose to do A rather than B, that same chain of causes will produce exactly the same effect if it were ever repeated. So you had no real free choice, even though you thought you had. And I answered part of B there. The fact that I have to deliberate before making a decision proves that I'm not determined. But here again, hard determinists would say, you're only kidding yourself. You think you have two real options, and you think you're deliberating. But as a matter of fact, the laws of nature that govern the molecular world determined your choice, and you only appeared to have two live options. So you can see this is a very rigid view, and again it says that I make no free choices and I'm not responsible for what I do. It is impossible to predict another person's behavior. But this inability to predict what we're going to do this afternoon is the way I put it when I went over this the first time. For the hard determinist just means that you and I don't have enough information about the prior causes acting on your choices this afternoon. You know, the atoms and molecules that go to make up those prior choices and all the subtle laws that govern them. They would say, if we had an omnipotent entity like Laplace's demonic entity who knows the position at every moment in time of every molecule and atom in the universe and has the calculating ability of what we would call today a supercomputer, in principle, since all of our choices are determined by prior causes, if we were Laplace's demon and we knew all of those prior causes, we could predict with 100% accuracy in advance our behavior this afternoon, because it's all determined ahead of time by the laws of nature and the positions of the atoms and molecules that make us up. In other words, the only reason we can't predict human behavior is our own ignorance of all the causal factors involved. But the thought is, if we did know all the causal factors involved, we would be able to predict our behavior with 100% accuracy. You know, so that's hard determinism, and you know, it's not everyone's choice. And of course, if you believe we're a dual entity, you know, many philosophers like Descartes and Kant and Locke have thought that we have an immaterial part to us that's not 100% subject to the laws of nature, and so we can make free choices. So you kind of have to buy into materialism to be a good hard determinist. Well, Leopold and Loeb wanted to commit their murder. They wanted to plan it out meticulously. Should we hold in number 4 that if they committed the crime because they wanted to do it, then they therefore acted freely in doing so and should be held fully responsible, both legally and morally, for what they did, even if this means giving them the death penalty? Or should we agree with Clarence Darrow and hard determinists that even if they committed the murder because they wanted to do so, nevertheless causal factors in their environment and heredity are the ones that are really responsible for their coming to have this want? In other words, this is what essentially Clarence Darrow argued. You know, if you read Eddie's speech, he basically says that the real causes, the real responsibility for what Leopold and Loeb did lies in back of them. It doesn't lie with them and the choices they made that day, but it lies in back of them in the causal history of each one of them that included their dysfunctional family environments and other things about them, their genetics. You know, so I asked you to weigh in on this in question 4. Now, to go to question 5, we switch to utilitarianism. And pretty much we're going to do just what we did on free will. And utilitarianism on this test, we saw that whether you call it the hedonistic calculus, the calculus of pleasures, the hedonic calculus, or something else, basically Bentham thought that we could measure pains and pleasures and weigh them off against one another when we were trying to choose courses of actions. So you can see that they presume a certain amount of free will that hard determinists don't. And you have that detailed example from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy in your PowerPoint. And if you're going to do 5, what I ask you to do is get a little creative and make up one of your own. And we saw that Bentham thought we would use things like the intensity of a pleasure or pain, the duration in time of a pleasure and pain, whether a pleasure is followed by pleasurable or unpleasurable sensations, the certainty of a pleasure or pain, that we would take into account these marks and use them to assign numbers to pleasures and pains. And we saw that his original concept was that we could talk about pleasures and pains quantitatively. So to continue for question 5, I asked you to kind of give us an example of using Bentham's calculus, and what are some of the possible problems? Well, what are some of the problems? I mean, pleasures and pains. Do we see people's pleasures and pains? I mean, we can look at behavior, at expressions, but we know that people can hide their real pleasures and pains. Plus, we have to predict future pleasures and pains, which we're not going to see on utilitarianism. So the fact that they're subjective, one of the things that means is that there's no way to specify exactly what counts as 1 hedon's worth of pleasure or minus 1 hedon's worth of pain. Remember, hedon for Bentham was a countable unit for pleasures and pains, just like degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit are countable units for temperature, or a meter is a countable unit for length. But it doesn't seem that we can exactly define what a hedon is. So that poses problems. You know, are they a serious obstacle? Well, you can discuss that. 6, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on. Remember, I gave you a link to this video if you weren't here the day we viewed it in class. The video on utilitarianism also talks about the real-world problem of using utilitarian reasoning to consider whether it's the right thing to do to clear thousands of acres of forest, displace 10,000 native peoples, in order to build a hydroelectric dam that may benefit hundreds of thousands or millions of people, give them cheaper electricity, a better lifestyle because they can use conveniences, you know, that they wouldn't be able to use otherwise, like air conditioners and washing machines, etc., make their life easy and happier. So you can balance out the happiness of many people against the unhappiness of the few, the 10,000 villagers that would have to be displaced. And utilitarianism says if you're going to create more happiness than the pain you cause the minority group, then go for it. Then that's the right thing to do. You know, so note, I usually put a very strong disclaimer here, and I do mean it. I mean, if your tendency, and we did have a lot of late term papers come in, is to turn in things late, you want to really fight against it here, because I'm saying not only am I not going to, okay, the only way I'm going to guarantee that something will be counted, whether it's a test 2 essay you still owe me, or a term paper you still owe me, or a final exam essay, the only way I guarantee that they will be counted is if they are physically in my hands when we leave the exam room. Okay? No other way. And so, if your tendency is to get things in late, you want to fight against it. You know, because frequently I'm so under the gun that I don't have time to go mousing around the internet when I got to get the grades in by a certain date and time. You know, oh, did somebody turn in something late? And of course, the last thing you want to do is leave a paper copy in my mailbox. Your exam is the second of two that I'm giving, right? There's the one for the 11 o'clock class on Friday, then yours on Monday. After I leave here Monday, I do not physically plan to be back on campus till late January, till we're ready to go back. So I will not see something that's left in my mailbox, you know. And again, you know, anything can happen, you know, if you try to email something. Well, all right. So most of this I've gone over. I'm not going to go over fatalism, but in the last 10 minutes. Remember, consequentialist theories say the only factors relevant to working out what it's right to do are the results, the consequences of what we do. Nothing else matters. And so that's the relationship between an action's results and its moral rightness or wrongness. What gives you the best consequences is what you want. And for utilitarianism, it says what gives you the best consequences for all concerned, for everyone affected by your action, is the best result. And that may not give the best consequences for you. Utilitarianism allows us to take the moral view, to stand back from our decision and ask what's right without asking, well, how am I going to come out? Don't worry about non-consequentialist theories there. We didn't go into them. How did Bentham and Mill differ in their views? Well, again, for Bentham, the only thing that matters is the quantity of pleasure. He said quantity of pleasure being the same. Pushpin's as good as poetry. In other words, all pleasures are on a par if the amount of pleasure, the quantity you have, is the same. But this open utilitarianism up to the criticism that it doesn't see a relevant distinction between the pleasure you and I would get from, say, reading poetry or going to, a play or something like that, versus the pleasure that the pig out there in the field gets from eating slop, or the pleasure we would get from, say, eating an ice cream sundae. Mill tried to defend utilitarianism and hedonism, the view that pleasure alone is good for its own sake. Anything else that's good morally is only good insofar as it promotes pleasure or happiness and lessens pain and unhappiness. So, Mill said, look, we need to take the quality of pleasures into consideration. But the problem with that is it seems to abandon hedonism because it seems to suggest, as Mill does, that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied. Better to have a lower quantity of pleasure but a higher pleasure, like the pleasure of discussing philosophy, than to just have the mere pleasures of sensation, like the pig has in eating slop, or we would have in eating an ice cream cone. And so Mill suggests then that whatever makes these higher pleasures higher, it's not just pleasure alone, because you have a lower quantity of pleasure if Socrates is dissatisfied. But if they're preferable, what he's saying is there are other factors that make them valuable in and of themselves, and other critics have recognized this, and this abandons hedonism, which says that only pleasure is valuable for its own sake. Contemporary utilitarians are pluralists. They're not all hedonists, even though people like Peter Singer is a hedonist. And they recognize other types of goods like knowledge, satisfaction of human preferences, self-realization as goods in and of themselves. Again, utilitarianism, one of its criticisms is that it makes the past irrelevant. So if I made a promise in the past, I don't need to keep it if balancing out future results, if breaking the promise gives me better future results for all concerned. And I gave you the example of the person on his deathbed who wants you to leave $50,000 to his gambler nephew, and you promise to do it after he dies, but you're on utilitarian grounds. It says the right thing to do would be to break your promise and choose a course of action that results in the greatest good for the greatest number, which would much more likely be fulfilled if you broke your promise, did not give the man's money to his gambler nephew, but instead, say, donated it to a children's hospital or to something like World Vision. So, and again, the principle of utility we saw as the main principle. It says that we should act to promote the greatest good for the greatest number. Hedonists define good in terms of happiness or pleasure. We saw that in Bentham's hedonistic calculus, even though we can't specify what a unit of pleasure is, a modern-day cost-benefit analysis is utilitarian reasoning that weighs the benefits of what you do over the costs. And it works out especially for big public policy decisions. So that's another way of approaching something using utilitarian reasoning, where the morally good is defined in terms of economic benefits and the morally bad is economic costs. So I already went over quantitative and qualitative differences. So bring a number 2 pencil, bring your Scantron, and as I said, you can use anything that's printed on paper, your notes, printouts of PowerPoints, stuff like that. Okay.